So hi, gang. So welcome back after that not terribly thorough November session that we couldn't get to. Um, but thanks for joining me anyhow, even though we had that frustrating one. Um, Couple orders of business. I think everybody on here has been here at least once, so I don't have to go through my long spiel, but I will let you know that I'm not locked down on my class schedule for 2025 yet, except to say that I have two confirmed in-person clasp making classes. One will be a 2-day workshop on the East Coast in Connecticut, Southern Connecticut. That'll be in mid-March, but I don't have which weekend yet nailed down. And then I will also be doing a 3-day version of that class on the West Coast in Portland, sometime probably in April or May. Again, not locked down yet. I'm going to also do at least one hollow forms virtually. I'm still determining whether that'll be through a school or direct, the way I sometimes do it. And I am going to be trying to tweak my stone setting class, which has been called Bezels Less Ordinary because it was focused mostly on step bezel work and then a couple of funky things. I'm going to try and include a little bit of bezels and a little bit of prongs in that new version of it. So I'll revamp that and that'll be another virtual class in all likelihood. And I'll keep you guys apprised and I'll put it up on my website and in my social media and all the places. I'm just waiting for a couple schools to confirm some dates before I settle on the remaining dates for the season. If you have schools that you think would want me there, primarily on East or West Coast, or willing to spend money on travel for me as a relative unknown in the field, I'm happy to talk to them. But I still want to only teach about 4 or 5 classes a year at most. So it'll be a tight schedule. What else? If you haven't, always remember to put in the Rio for Schools code if you are not currently getting credit for one of the teachers that you're studying with, because that will keep you on a 6-month of Rio Pro status, basically. And we are going to take a break from our regularly scheduled giant hollow form project to work on the Cogswell clasp that a couple of you have asked about learning more about. This is the very first thing I ever learned from John Cogswell, other than from reading his book before I met him, but this was the very first class that I ever took from him. And then I also studio assisted him on a subsequent session with this and several other clasps. And so it has a special place in my heart. And the problem is that the parts that he recommended for using for it, I can't find them anymore. So we're going to talk about some of the variations. I happen to have some left over because I bought several sets earlier when they were still available. We'll talk about some of the other options as we go through it. But before we do that, I want to catch up with you all and find out if anybody has some in-flight projects that they want to share, and or if you've got some sticking points in your box of unfinished things that need a little boost. So I'm going to remove spotlight from me for now and see who's out there. What do you got? Anyone? Nancy, you got something?
Well, I had a great time this last semester because I went to my local community college and got to do jewelry classes. So
Nice.
there were 7 weeks. I did two different sessions. One of them was stone setting, and I've done
Cool.
setting, but I haven't made a lot of my own settings. And boy, is that
Mm-hmm.
challenging! I started
Mm-hmm.
watching the Cogswell that you have. Um, I just have to remind myself you must do something many, many, many times. Then
Yes.
you're comfortable with it, you know?
Yeah.
Yep.
And even starting simple with round stones, doing
Yeah.
prong settings and getting your jump rings to sit in there and everything else made the stone setting of round stone be like easy. You know what I'm saying? It definitely
Right.
was frustrating, but I made
Good.
quite a
I'm glad you're
few.
challenging yourself.
Say again?
I said, I'm glad you're challenging yourself with that. That's cool.
It is. And it's one of those things where for a special piece, I would do.
Good.
For things that are more commercial, so to speak, people are not going to compensate me for my time. So I won't
Right.
feel bad about using, a commercial four prong type of setting.
Yep.
But like I say, I did make quite a few and got them almost done. They're not perfect, but that's how you learn. So that was
Yeah.
really. And then the
Nice.
next class that we did was all about surface textures. So that's much more up my alley. That is something I'm very comfortable with. Some of the things I'd done and other things were new, but we did fusing, we did kambu, we did reticulation, we did not etching well, no, we did etching, but the other thing I'm thinking of is repoussé, except we didn't use a pitch bowl. So we did a couple
Okay.
of different types where we use basically balsa wood or a harder wood to, use that as your surface. So one of the things that we did is this is just very simple and it's not complete yet, but it's basically very fine sheet and then put a
Yeah.
rim around it. And I need to put a bail on before I start doing the rest. But
Nice.
this is something where you can approach from front or back or both, you know,
Yeah.
and all sorts of things you can do with this, whatever shape you want to make. Um,
Yeah.
I've done some work in pitch a long time ago, and it is kind of a PIA. So having other methods to do that
Yeah.
definitely was really fun. Um, One of the things too, I really hadn't done much etching, so we took a nickel plate and made a template for that you can repeat because the nickel can stand being through
Rolling.
the mill.
Nice.
So this is kind of shell
Cool.
fan shape, which is
And
something I like a lot too. And then we did
was
some.
it was it an acid etch or was it a saltwater etch or what did you do?
It was an acid etch. The college has
Okay.
like everything, so it was.
Okay.
Probably at home I do PMP, even though it
Yeah.
takes forever. I'm just not going to get into the hazards, the equipment, that kind of thing. I have looked at the salt water, but PMP is not bad, using
Still
the.
takes disposal, but yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's true. But it's also reusable up to, until you wear it
For a
out.
long time.
So, and
Yep.
then this is a little copper piece. So,
Nice.
that is I can make into something.
Very
So,
cool.
yeah, so with the fusing we did, I've done a lot of fusing, and one of my favorite things to fuse is to take your sheet and then I like to make a lot of different shapes, copper or brass and silver, and then solder them down and then roll through the mill.
Nice.
Right. So I have a sheet of this and I already made a little pair of earrings with what I cut out. So and then just plain fusing. This is also something that I'm not quite sure where I'm going to go with it, but um it's just taking scrap,
Yep.
take scrap and do this. And I probably may put a rim around it to get those sharp edges contained. And
Yeah.
then, I probably put some stone of some sort in there. So, and I did a lot of other little fun things that aren't, were just practice, so to speak. But another thing that the guy who teaches, he's a fantastic maker and a great teacher, and he does a lot of fold forming. He's actually won in Charles Newton Brains competition a couple times. He's gotten
Cool.
awards. So that's the other thing we did, which was basically air chasing.
Very
Mhm.
cool. Wow. So you've got a whole bunch of raw materials basically to inspire your next builds. That's pretty fabulous.
Exactly. So that's why I
Cool.
just thought I'd say, I haven't been into my box so much. I'm just creating more stuff to put in it.
That's okay. I
Yeah,
have many of those kinds of projects. Nice though. And
that's
there's
right.
some cool techniques that you learned in there too. That sounds like a fun sampler class.
Yeah, it
Very
really,
cool.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
where when you do something like that, and then the brain starts going, you just get a lot of ideas and
Yep.
play. And as we all know, sometimes when you're working and it's work, it's not as fun. So getting an opportunity to play is like exciting. So that's my,
Absolutely. Nice.
Start to have
Nice.
fun again.
yeah.
All right. Anybody else have something they want to share?
I've been
Anyone?
doing something, but
Yeah,
it's not from the box.
that's okay. Is
Remember
it
last
something that
time
you
I
are stuck
said,
on or just to show off?
just to show what I've been doing, I guess.
Good. Okay.
I'm teaching myself how to sand cast.
Okay.
So this is one of my little sculptures,
Ooh,
and then this is the sand cast.
Nice.
Didn't come out,
very
but
cool.
I'm working on it.
Yeah.
So
So where did the casting not come out? Or would you say the top it
the
blew out at the
hammering,
top? Is that what I'm seeing?
yeah,
Yeah.
this part here.
So it's all about getting some more air holes coming back out probably and spruing down a
Mm-hmm.
thick enough sprue. But that looks pretty
Mm-hmm.
impressive for a first cast. And
It's
nothing
actually
says you can't cut off
the
pieces
fourth
and use what you.
cast.
Oh, is it the fourth one? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then it's impressive for progression through the casts.
This one
Nice.
didn't come out. This one I did with the hollow form, remember in your class?
Yeah, I can see that being a really hard cast because of the cutbacks in the walls.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that you got that far in your cast is damned impressive. That one's a really hard pour.
Mm-hmm.
And plus
Yeah,
they're so heavy, that's so much metal that makes it even harder to get
Yeah.
that big
yeah,
ore.
I'm just
but
experimenting.
super cool.
But this
Yeah.
one came out.
Oh, have fun.
I mean, I do things
That's
with
fantastic.
figures.
Yeah.
And this one came out in sorta. It's missing part of the
Is that
arm.
so you're moving it around. It looks when you move it like it's Wile E. Coyote. Is it? That's very cool. Very
It's
cool.
I call her crazy.
There we go. Yeah. Yeah. That's a beautiful shape. It's got lots of movement to it.
Mm-hmm. So
I
that's what I
love it.
did.
What is that going to go on? Anything?
Well, I got
Is
into
it?
a show to show my sculpture.
Yeah.
So I'm experimenting. The show is in March.
Nice.
So I'm trying to play around with different metals and then with the pieces I already have to make
Cool.
multiples. Mm-hmm. So that was
Very
my
cool.
thing.
That's
Oh, but I
man,
did have
that's some
one
impressive
more.
work. Oh yeah.
This one. I put the diamond in there.
Can you put your hand behind it so we can really see? Or paper or something? Yeah. Wow. All
And is
right.
the show in a gallery or a studio or like a selling show?
In my home.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Yeah,
No,
I
the
bought
the,
I
the
bought two
sculpture show that
different.
you said in March.
Oh, it's
No, yeah,
called
where's the
it's going to be in Chicago, but they are all over. It's called the Other Art Fair.
nice.
I
Very
did it
cool.
I did it last year, but I did it with my drawings. And then this year they have a new part where they're going to include ceramics and sculpture, and so I got into that part of the show. So
Fabulous.
we'll see.
I have only done one grand scale sculpture in my career, and it was the size of a manhole cover, and I did not do the pour.
Mhm,
I'm
mhm.
not the one who's going to be pouring 500 pounds of molten brass or
No,
bronze, I guess we
no,
use. But so
no,
that's a
this
very
is,
cool, to be able to do that scale is really cool.
yeah, yeah. That's what I'm trying to do
Nice.
because when I take it to the casting place, they always cut the bottom part out. And it's like I want it to be a sculpture with a little ball,
Mm,
you know?
yeah. Oh,
And
and they're cutting the sprue directly. Yeah. They think it's a
then it's
sprue and
hard
not
to
a span.
solder. Hmm.
Gotcha.
So that's what I've been up
Very
to
cool.
so far.
Nice. Anybody else been working on anything in the box, out of the box, elsewhere? Nothing? Okay. It's all good. Um, all right. So today's project is a big departure from what we've been doing, except in that it's a complicated clasp. So I'm going to give you guys a bit of a background. Oops, I got to spotlight myself. I always forget that part.
Hmm.
Um, a bit of background on this clasp. It is what's called a knocker clasp, and it's John's original design, although you can now find manufactured versions of them out there, which is a whole story unto itself. Um, this is a clasp that um, John usually makes fairly large, or used to make fairly large scale. I don't know how well it will work at a much smaller scale, but I'm going to be doing experiments to find out on your behalf because I can't find the big component for it. It also is not great in the scale that it's done in for lightweight chains. This is really about some kind of heavy, like consequential chain or elements that connect it really solidly. You don't want a really wussy chain because there's a lot of pivot and movement to it. And so I'm going to actually show you all here what I'm talking about. So this is the way that it works has a lot of movement to it, right? And so this clasp, the knocker part, is this ball that pops out. So it's technically a friction clasp. And then one component slides off over one side and the other one can't, right? So this is locked in place. And so once you put it back, you put it there and you close the knocker in between the two latch points of the friction portion of the clasp. So I'm going to try and show you, I'm going to get this over to the close-up camera and show you some close-ups of it. Let me zoom in a little bit.
Is that hollow?
This is hollow, and that's what I can't find in the size that John worked in these anymore. They used to be sold by Metalliferous and nobody else, basically. But it can be done solid. It's just this is going to be a honkin' heavy clasp if it's done solid. So it can be scaled a little bit smaller, but yeah, it's a looping tube that when they were available come like this, right? And this is
Hmm.
fairly light. It's not inconsequential, but it's reasonably light. Um, and then we're taking a slice out of it that is going to make the angle for the bead to pop in. And then the tricky part is getting all of these pieces here. And so it's conceptually a fairly straightforward, oops, I keep going into my own logo there. There we go. Conceptually, it's a fairly simple concept, right? There is a holder point, and we have to get our lock right into the slot. And there's a connected point that will never let the clasp fall off, right? So that one's always going to be connected. And on the opposite side, we slide the piece on
Can
that's
you lower a
available.
little? Can you lower
Yep,
a
let
little
me
bit,
actually
please?
zoom out a smidge. Oh, too far.
Or
Too far.
there you go. Or
Better?
because you're
Yeah.
okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so the one side is the locked in place, which means it's going to not lose the clasp. I keep moving out of frame, I'm sorry. So that one will never get past that point. And this one is the connector. And then we have the movable knocker portion of it, right? So our components are a whole boatload of very precise jump rings, a single hole bead, and this tube piece, right? Now, this is the scale that John taught it at. And so it, as I said, it needs something fairly hefty to go with it. Let me zoom even further out so you guys can actually see this necklace in whole. And so if you were to put too lightweight of a necklace of a chain on it, it's going to have enough pivot and torque that it may potentially just eventually wear the chain out by the time it's done, right? So we want something that has stability to it. Now, I'm not saying you can't have small connectors, but like a long basic cable chain or something would eventually have too much torque and it would get distorted and not hold the weight of this chain. You could potentially modify this design to have like a multi-slide. It would take a little finagling on how your end piece connects, but so you could have like sets of pearl strands or something like that off of it. But you want something that's going to keep it from doing too much of this on either side. Other elements of it are that has to be something strong enough. So the tube is fairly solid unto itself. This particular style of tube is a seamed and not soldered tube. However, there may be others, if we can find them, there may be others out there that are seamed and soldered or fused or what have you. You could also ostensibly make your own by doing a draw plate pull on tubing. I've never had a ton of success in getting a true circle out of my tubing. And I have on my drawing board, I have designs that are not circular. So I'm looking to see if I can get a version of this that's in a funkier shape, either square or like a hexagon where the side points would come out. And those I would make out of either tubing that I cut in segments and angle or wire. So I can also do this instead of using the tube. I can use heavy gauge wire, and I'm going to give you some measurements on all these in a little bit. But overall, the real pain point is these jump rings because they have to be specific proportional sizes. So I have built a set so that we can see the components, and then we're going to build another set as we go. And by the way, they came in literally 15 minutes before I got down here. This is the closest thing I can find to these.
Oh,
And I had to
wow.
order them from overseas. I got them off of Etsy. I'm hoping that these will actually be manageable because I think if I scale down the bead and everything and keep it lightweight, I may be able to make a mini version of what I just showed you out of these. But I'm going to play with that and see what I think the strength factor is once I've cut the slice into it. But yeah, if anybody has any ideas of where to hunt down these bigger ones, they were literally only available at Metalliferous in the United States 12 years ago when I first took this class, or 14, whatever it was. And they're not around anymore, so we can't find them, and I haven't found an alternative. So here's the design that this piece that I'm making is going to be going towards. It's 3 Chinese writing stones, rather, not water stones, writing stones. And this is part of my chain collection where I like to take elements of what's in the chain and bring what's in the stone and bring it into the chain. But it had enough of the circle size stuff that I thought it would do well for me. And did I start hissing again? Because I lost my little fluffy thing on my mic. Am I doing okay without it? Or are you guys getting a
Yes.
hiss? Okay, good. I will leave the little fluffy thing that's supposed to help with that. All right, so the pieces that we make, we are going to make the rod. We're going to make a set of jump rings, and I'll give you little names for each of these. A set of jump rings that exactly fits on the ends of the tube once we've cut it open. And when I say exactly, like I may even have to use tools to get some of these off. Nope, there we go. Okay, so 2 that are what we call the end cap pieces. 1 that is going to be locked behind the end cap that is connecting the permanent connection to whatever you're attaching it to, as opposed to the slightly larger one that has to fit just over one of our end caps. So you can see how that end cap nests in there, but I can't get this guy over one of the end caps. It's a little too small. right? So we've got our locking side, we've got our opening side, and we've got our two end caps. And then we have a set of components that have to be really, really snug that are going to get soldered down. See if I can even get that one off. I may not be able to. So we have two rings that should be just barely scooching past, and those are going to both be soldered in place, right? Those are going to be the ones that lock the final ring together. And this final ring is what is going to have, if I can show this to you better, this is going to be coming off of the final ring. And that final ring should be just loose enough that it can spin around the tubing, because that's our hinge point, right? Or rather, this is our hinge point. So it's going to be doing the knocking part. So the two locking ones, the one that I can't get easily off of here because it's so tight, and its partner, are going to trap this here on the center point of the clasp. So that's going to be soldered down. This is going to get put into place with the rod set to the right size. Then the other one gets put on the other side of it, and we solder it down without soldering the center one to anything, right? Because it has to spin freely. So we've got some tricky soldering bits that go on in this. And the order of operations is super critical, because before we solder our end caps on, we have to have at least one of these in place, right? Because it's getting locked in before we cap it over here. So that sounds complicated, because it is complicated, but I promise you that the thing that's going to make you want to throw this across the room while you're working on it is making all the damn jump rings. Because these have to be so snugly the right size that it literally took most of us a day and a half in that first class just to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 little jump rings all freaking day long. Questions about those components that we're talking about? Anyone?
I was just wondering, when do you put, if you're gonna not solder the one in the middle, are you gonna
Mm-hmm.
solder it to the ball before you put it on there?
You have to, yeah. So that's again the order of operations. So before we put this one in place, we're going to solder this peg, but we
Okay.
have to size it to fit exactly where we want, right? So
Mm-hmm.
what we're actually going to do for the order of operations is we're going to build one side of it like that, right? And get those all soldered in, because then that's all the locking mechanisms. And that'll give us the touch point for where our bead is supposed to land, even though we don't have the other half in place yet. And that'll tell me how long I can cut, how much I have to cut this down, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then once I've got it cut down, then I can attach it to my middle ring
Okay.
at the right length, so that when I put it in place on the inside, so there's my locked down side, there's my gonna spin side, and then I follow it up with its partner locking ring, then I can oh so carefully do a little solder right here without letting it flow to my ring that has the rod on it. Does that sound like magic? Because it sounded like magic to me day one, and it's some tricky soldering, and it's
Yeah.
frustrating. But the key to it all is the right size jump rings. So
Mm-hmm.
you're going to fight and you're going to fight and you're going to say, oh, I want to give up. That's good enough. Don't say that's good enough on these jump ring sizes. Any other questions about the high level overview that I've just given you before we start making one of these?
I have one question. So the one we're looking at right now, that's one of the few that you have left of the original two.
Yes.
Okay, so what
I
was your
think I might have one
proposition?
more hidden away.
So what
Pardon?
was your proposition as a replacement?
Right. So my proposition for replacement is what gauges of wire did I think? You can use 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 gauge wire, anywhere in that range, and make a similar size ring. The
Okay,
one modification you'd have to do besides, holy heck, that's really hard to get a perfect circle in, which you have to get a really perfect circle. The one modification you'll do is, instead of these hollows that we've got here, you're going to take a big ball burr and you're going to make a divot on each, because what the friction is counting on is that you have a place that when it gets through there, it hangs out with the tension popped into the hole,
that makes
right?
total sense. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're carving out a little divot for it. And honestly, I would go towards the 8 gauge. What you need is, this has to be heavy enough that it's not going to do this in response to having something clicking in and out of it. But not so heavy that you can't manipulate it while you're building. So I would actually probably try
So
going
you have to
into
work hard on
the
it?
you will have to do a little work hardening on it, but the heavier it is, the less work hardening you're going to have to do. I personally am not going to be able to bend by hand a 4 gauge ring.
Right.
I might be able to make movement on the 8 gauge end of things. So maybe try somewhere in 6 gauge and see how you do with it. Um, Ultimately, you can do some of that hardening by bending back and forth, but you got to be careful not to distort any of the rings that are at the center, or else we're going to have problems with it rotating, right? So play with the gauge that you think is going to be stable enough. And obviously, this should be sterling, not fine silver if you're doing it. Or brass. Brass, you probably won't have to do anything at all to harden. If you can get a brass ring in 8 gauge, you're fine. That's not going to move. That sucker isn't going to go anywhere. And let's see what else. There's modifications that you can absolutely do to this. I'm going to give you John's set of recommended ring sizes, but you can play with them. You can also, like in this particular design, I made my knocker one out of half round instead of out of round. You could also do a decorative center bar, as long as it can spin so that it does its knocker effect. You can do a decorative thing there. You can do decorative on these end ones. However, so I thought about whether I wanted to do one with square wire, but no matter what, part of what we need is that curve that you get to hold the ball from the inside of it. So even if I do square wire around the edges, I'm going to then be ball burring into the inside of the jump ring to make sure that I really have that hold the bead from either side, right? If I just did square wire, it would kind of go like this, and I want something into which it's going to snap. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Trying to think. Wait, but you could also mixed metal this. Like, it'd be really elegant if you did, gold bead or whatever. You can also take a hard stone bead, as long as you polish the heck out of your inside spots and know that it's going to eventually get a little scratched up. If you can't find a single hole bead of the right size, you could do a double hole bead and set a teeny tiny little faceted stone in a bezel, in a step bezel right at the top of the opposite side or something like that. So you aren't stuck if you can't find the single hole bead, but it does need to be a fairly consequential bead. So that's why I'm not sure the minis that I got are going to be scalable. I need enough hold that it can't easily pop out of its center point. So for proportions, the bead on this one is 6 millimeter, I think. Let me see, what is it? My bead is 6 millimeters, and the interior of this otherwise perfect, except that we can't get them anymore, tubing, the inner diameter is like 5.4 millimeters or something like that. So it's just the right proportion to hold the curve in. It's only actually really holding very well on one side. I think I must have distorted this along the way when I was polishing.
And
But go
is
ahead.
is that bead solid? The
No, it's a single hole, but it's just a standard bead with
Okay.
a single hole instead of a double. So it's a hollow bead. It's
Right.
not even a thick bead,
Right.
but the act of putting it on the rod closes it up and
Right.
makes it pretty solid.
And then the
Yeah.
jump rings, okay, so the quote unquote permanent jump ring, is that slightly smaller than the jump ring that we're going to feed over the end cap?
Yep. See that? So those are
Okay.
that's the size proportion. And
Okay.
the little guy, when I go over my end cap, it won't slide past, but the big guy, the end cap passes by. Right?
What was that
I
again?
figured it, that probably was in getting what I would be looking for visually is that they are close, right?
Yep.
That,
Very
that
close.
yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of make it tight on this particular
Right.
exercise.
Well, and it
Yeah.
looks like it almost fits in. So, that makes it maybe less than a millimeter in size difference.
This one, yeah, as far I would say is well less than a millimeter. Basically, you're doing a lot of what is the inner diameter of one relative to the outer diameter of the other consideration. So this one could have been minutely snugger, but it didn't have to be, the one that I pull off.
Yeah.
I wouldn't make it gargantuan because it'll look proportionally odd opposite the other one.
Right.
So I like to make them fairly close together.
That was my
Um,
thought too. I would like it to
yeah.
be not an eyesore.
Right, exactly. Now, another element I want to show you is the zigzag, which is an easier design to do than the straight line. So his base design is a straight rod that exactly fits up there. Your first time doing it, I actually recommend you plan to do a zigzag because then you can overshoot your sizing. It's much harder to get the exact perfect straight line sizing. So give yourself enough to not just be like, oops, I had to bend it because I didn't fit it right, and instead be, I'm bending it as a decorative element. Right? So this one's probably, when it was straight, it was probably about yay high on the piece, maybe a centimeter taller than it needed to be. But then what I'm doing when I get it, well, once I get it soldered into its position, is I'm doing my squiggle until it's tucked down into the connector. Right? So again, and then like I could put, a gold beads along this, or I wouldn't put any decorative elements on the main tubing, but if you were making your own tubing, heck yeah, you could make patterned tubing, textured in some way, hammer texture, and then make your tubing. If you can make your own tubing, this opens up a whole ton of possibilities for this particular style. If you can make your own tubing and get it to spiral, to curl into a good circle. Questions beyond that about the components before we start recreating this set so that you can see the pane? Anyone?
That's what us jewelers live for.
Right, right. Okay, I'm gonna do two things. I'm gonna paste the materials list that we're working with plus the alternative ideas into our chat, and I'm also gonna bring them up on my board so that because we're gonna work our way through these. And as much as you are going to hate making jump rings, I cannot tell you how important it is to make all the jump rings before you solder any of the jump rings. Oops, I didn't bring it up on screen. I just put it on my board. So we're going to make an end cap, a set of end cap rings out of 12 gauge. Those are the ones that lock the thing into place. We're going to make connector rings, one at either 16 or, oh, I'm sorry, no, the connector rings are the outside ones, so the ones that slide on or get locked in. And those we're going to make out of either 16 or 14 gauge because that makes them a little more delicate in the proportions. You could go higher. John, I'm just giving you the proportions John originally provided when he was teaching this. The locking rings, which are the ones to either side of the knocker that are going to get soldered into place, he does out of 14 gauge. And then the pivot hinge itself, he makes a little bit bigger. Now, that's the one that in this case I did out of the half round wire. But basically what he's looking for is a visual effect that you could again do all of these out of 14 gauge or out of uh 12 gauge or whatever, but he does the 14 gauge and then the 12 gauge to give a little rise, so it's a little decorative, like higher than the pieces on either side of it. Nothing says they can't all line up in a row for you if you want, but you could also change these proportions consequentially. The locking rings can be fairly delicate. All they're doing is being solder blocker points that stop the center knocker from sliding off course. And again, those could be decorative wire if you wanted to, twisted wire or something like that. As long as you can get a clean, solid interior solder on the jump ring so that it doesn't move. Then we have the knocker shaft itself is made out of 12 gauge, and this on this scale is one that I would not muck around with because this needs to stay solid at all times. We don't want give in this. So you could go heavier, but I wouldn't go lighter on this scale. And that's what when I play around with the much smaller one, I'm going to see what our limits are for how tiny it needs to be, because it won't have as much room to bend because it's shorter, but I don't want it to get too weak. Again, in this design, we're using the 6mm one hole ball. When I go to the smaller version, I'm going to use one of my scaled down beads from that. And then the ring size that the original was done around is a 26mm diameter with a 5mm tube. Oh, it wasn't even a 5.3. It was literally just 5. And it's not perfectly round. It's got this kind of like flattened bottom that it's not really showing on camera, I don't think. But it sort of goes flush a little bit at the bottom, which creates problems. So I do a little bit of squeezing to try and get it re-rounded at the edges, because we make it even worse when we start cutting into it. But those are our numbers, and you've got them also in chat, so you can copy and paste if you want. Let me see if there's anything else I want to do before we get further on this. Check my notes for a second. Clasp. Okay, so I think we're set to go on. I'm going to leave all the parts that I made a kit out of aside so that we can go to them in desperation if we need to. And I'm going to take our brand new clasp. Now, your equivalent to this, if you're going to work in wire, is that you're going to make a perfect round out of this. If you've got a ring bender, I strongly encourage you use it to get as round as possible. And I would also encourage you to actually go so far as to solder it closed and form it properly as if you were making a real ring. And then you'll do the equivalent cuts that we're about to do to this piece. And then those ends that you've cut open, that's where you're going to do your ball burr in. So what we want to do first is cut through an angled slice, because we're creating, I'm going to clear this off and do a little sketching for you. What we're doing is building the gap that has to make it snap in place. So when in doubt, cut less than you think you need to and cut more away. So we're doing basically like a pie slice out of this. So it's important that you not cut this way, but rather at that angle, creating the gap for it. But it's a subtle gap, so I'm not drawing it proportionally well. So if I have my bead here, I want just enough angle that it's going to have room to pop in. If I do it too upright, it's going to catch up at the corner, right? So it's a very slight angle, and I don't want to leave that much gap. I'm just doing that gap to show you where the bead is going to land, because when we're done, what it's actually going to need to do is hit right about there, so that the tension set happens, right? We're going to be aided by our locking rings that are going to fall onto the end of it, but we still need it to really be a snug pop so that the edges of the outermost rim of the bead is kind of hidden into the gap that we're creating. Is that making sense? I'm going to assume it is because I'm not hearing anything.
Yes.
I was
Okay.
just, I have a quick question.
Sure.
Because that to me, I see that as a hollow form if you can't buy
It
it.
is.
So, what if you were to make it square?
That's one of the things I have sketches to think about it in other ways.
Uh-huh.
And so it needs, what does it need? It needs the tiniest bit of flex, so it can't be wholly rigid. It needs this little tiny bit of movement in order to get the snap past,
Mm-hmm.
which wire will get you. And what I don't know is whether we can create a form that's square or something else that will have the pressure point. Now, I will say that if you're going square, it's going to create one different style movement no matter what we do on the side connectors, right? So if we have a circular shape and we got our bead snapped in there and everything, our jump rings are going to naturally center themselves. But if we go square, they're going to try to angle off in weird ways, which is why one of the things I'm looking at is, do we need to either do like a hexagon, in which case our center point rings, our connector rings, would find their way to those points. And so our knocker would come up here between these two, right? And we'd still have the jump ring, and the connector ring. Or do we need to make something that forces it, like parallelogram, which would force the rings to hit one corner or the other, most likely this upper corner. So you're welcome to try the other variations on this yourself. And you could, again, either do them by constructing out of tubing. You know, you can go ahead and cut tubing and do those designs and build a hollow form, which will keep the weight down, but is going to add extensively to your time to build. Or you can make it out of heavy gauge wire, which will be a lot easier. But yeah, John has never talked about doing them in other shapes, but it's immediately where my head goes because I want to be able to make funky versions that go with my designs. But I have not yet tried any of those funky versions. I just have a lot of sketches. Okay, so I am gonna use the cut that we already have, and then I'm gonna measure my bead, if I can figure out where the heck I put my calipers. Measure my bead to confirm that it is in fact the size I think it is. And it is a 5.96 bead. I'm going to call that 6. And I'm going to go a little shy of it. So I'm going to go like a 5.25-ish for my first cut. And then I'll file a little bit more away. 5 point, yep, come back here. This is not a terribly exacting thing. You just want it less than the width of your bead. And again, we're going to make it pie sliced. Let me put a mark down so I can actually see where I'm cutting. Pie sliced, but a very narrow angled pie. So I'm making a mark on my outer edge, and then I'm going to cut inward on the slight angle. And in this case, this bead is fairly thin-walled, so I'm still using my typical default 2/0 blade to cut this. Just going to be careful because it is an unsoldered seam on the inside, so I want to make sure it doesn't get all out of whack. And Got a lot of spring to it. Come on. Okay, so just that tiny little segment pulled out. And then I'm going to check to see if my bead in fact stays put. That's actually pretty good. Right? And there's still a little torque that I've got to take care of, which we'll get to as we clean things out. I can do a little touch-up filing to get this clean, because that was a little bit of a sloppy cut. Just going to grab my file. And I just want a flush surface. We're going to do some additional cleaning later when we get our jump ring in place, but it's a lot easier to get the jump ring on when it's a clean surface to begin with. And you are going to want to make sure that you get any of the chatter that you get from the saw blade around the edges taken off, because that subtle little catch point could really mess up your accountability on like how you're getting your sizing if you have any little burrs of metal. So I just take all of those off a little bit, make sure it's clean. Check the side that was factory cut. That's looking pretty good. And I want to get rid of that torque a little bit. There we go. All right. So we've got our baseline, and now we're going to design the set of jump rings for it. So I'm going to start with my 12 gauge wire. If I can figure out where I put it. There we go. And I cannot tell you how critical it is to anneal your wire in this situation. Otherwise, you're going to be fighting even harder with your jump rings than you need to, and getting a lot of marks on them as you try to force them, because this is reasonably heavy gauge to be working with. So I'm going to hop over, take a chunk of this off because I don't need anywhere near that much. And I'm going to do a pretty thorough annealing of this puppy. It helps if I've turned on my torch. Can you guys still hear me successfully?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good.
Yes.
And my microphone is working as intended. Much as I hate wearing a microphone, it's good to know that it's doing better quality than last time. All right. And if you're fighting your jump rings for the last little bit of fit, anneal again. Seriously, this is going to make a world of difference for you. The other thing to keep in mind is always make your jump rings smaller than intended and then gradually work your way up. And you're going to see one of the rough ways that I do that, because we're going to have to do it to all of our jump rings in a moment. But I'm really annealing sort of to the limits of what I would want to anneal. Just shy of turning cherry on this, and usually I try not to push quite that far. Then we're going to do that wait for the 10 count, remembering that when you're doing the quench, that is a big part of the annealing process. It does the last 10 or 15% of softening of the metal if you quench it while hot, but you got to wait long enough that it won't shock it. Right, we're gonna necklace out of there for one, dry this puppy off. And I want really, like, that's what I'm looking for, is super soft and flexible. And one of the things that I find for making the various size jump rings is go to your, if you don't have a jump ringer, which you're welcome to use your jump ringer if you do, but go find your DAPs and find a DAP that is a little smaller than, so that the whole of the DAP can just sort of just fit in there, and that the end of it looks like it would be the interior dimension, because we're going to have some spring factor. It also gives you this handy dandy, most of them have a little notch in there, so you can use that to manipulate your wire starting point. I also happen to have a pair of jump ringer parallel jaw pliers, which are great to start this off, but I also know I'm going to lose that first bit of scrap. So I start making a jump ring in whatever my smallest size is that I can make on that plier, and then I move over to what I can do in here, and it gives me a little something to hold on to, and I can start to tighten it down. Let's see if my hands can deal with this for 2 days in a row. I need something to grip a little better with. Let's do it. I'm going to actually get my vice grips because my hands are cramping a lot today. See if I can hold on to things a little better. Again, knowing I'm scrapping my first couple, if I can hold it in place, then I can get some necessary torque and get gradually tighter and tighter on my jump rings. Come on, hang in there. They're not going to be beautiful at this stage of the game. I just care about, can I make them small enough for this first set of rings? And 12 gauge is sort of my limit for things I can do by hand without having some tools like this to hold on to it. And I'm going to make more than I need to because I'm guaranteed to screw some of them up as I'm sizing things. Let's see. So then my end points I'm going to scrap again, but before I do that, I'm going to try and tighten down as much as I can to whatever I'm making my jump rings on. And then I've got a couple of options in there. And I'm going to see if they're even close, if I can get one in to the slot. And it looks like I'm pretty close. I may want to snug them down a little bit, but it's a good starting size. That's the secret, is that I picked that out yesterday because I knew it would fit this, but when you do yours, just double check that you're getting something close to what you want. You can snip these, but then you got a lot more filing and cleanup to do. So I strongly urge you to actually saw jump rings, which is one of my personal least favorite activities in the world. Because I'm always fearing I'm going to cut through faster than I realize and cut myself or whatever, but I'm going to just do a ring or two at the start and make sure that my sizing is good. If it's not, I still have a chance to tighten my coil and make them a little smaller. The other thing I warn about is that it's really easy to forget and be cutting where you're actually cutting through the other side of the jump ring when you're working this thick. But again, I just want to get a tester, and this is my junk end anyhow that I'm never going to be able to use. And I want to see roughly if it's going to do the trick. If I close it down, is it going to be right about the size that I need? Yes, and a little small, which is what I'm going for, because I'm going to be stretching it a tiny bit at a time until it's just tight enough, because these are the locking ones that I need to be able to solder onto the end. So I'm pretty pleased with that coil. Now I'm going to do a little more cutting of them to give myself a set of them. You will be picking up more jump rings than you've picked up in a long time, because they'll be falling all over as you're sizing them and as you're cutting them and all kinds of things. This is one of the projects where I'm constantly looking for things on the floor. If you're having trouble getting them moved around without marking them up, remember you can always you can always tape your pliers to keep them from marking so much. Come on. Let's make a cut line. If you find it way too challenging to cut your jump rings from this side, you can another trick is to turn your saw blade inside out on your saw backwards. So the teeth are facing here, and thread it through the ring and cut towards yourself. Cut towards yourself. So you're pulling instead of pushing. Sometimes that gives a little bit better access to keep a straight line, but it's harder to see if you're cutting the other side when you do that. So your mileage may vary. Stop there because we don't really need 73 of these. At least one more. There we go. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is do a little hammering on these puppies to flatten them out. So I'm just going to use my mallet. Yeah, like I said, you go chasing after jump rings. Oh, that one rolled way far away. Hang on. Just trying to escape to the other room. And then we've got to actually get them closed up enough that they're useful. Okay, how did I manage to lose one in between? Oh, there we go. I have 4 now, so I just use a little bit. I'm going to tape these because they do tend to scratch it up. So I'm just using a couple wraps of painter's tape. These, I would love these to work better than they do, but they aren't strong enough to really move 12 gauge and that kind of heaviness. I'm just going to do a little bit of protective coating. And it's not going to be 100% to stop the marking, but it'll at least limit it for a while. Because now what I want to do, my rings closed. You have favorite techniques or tips for how you close these kinds of rings, I will happily hear your ideas. Sometimes you got to hammer them. Sometimes you just got to keep bullying them until they get there. The other thing to remember is that once we get them close to closed, we can do a second saw through to get a really close cut line, because what I'm getting here is a little bit too much gapping because my angles don't perfectly line up. So I'm going to do a saw through on these once I've gotten them closer to closed. Nearly perfect. That never happens. Other techniques for getting them a little bit closer closed, I've seen people put their jump rings in, if you have a bezel making, the angled bezel maker for circular bezel sets. You can put these into those and tap them down and they'll get more circular. I can actually probably find a set that I can do that with. but sometimes that marks it up even more because those devices that you use to tap down muck things up. It's being a pain. Use something a little more squinchy. Let's see what we got. There we go. That's not going to mark it up too badly. Okay, so I've got 4 to choose from, some of which are better than others. I'm going to take my saw and do a second pass to get a cleaner seam. Because with this thick a gauge, it is not wanting to fit cleanly. So it's just a quick saw through. I can do that final closing down. Nice, there we go. I know jump ring making is one of those most captivating aspects of watching somebody make jewelry. Super exciting. Come
It
on.
is.
Is it? Okay. You're glad to see other people struggle with making jump rings? We all do. Okay, this one's so snug that it needs to be unstrung in order to get it off there. There we go. Yeah, it feels like one of those aspects of jewelry making that there ought to be a better way. And I've used the jump ringers and I hate them. Like, they cause me more strife than help. If I were making, thousands and thousands of jump rings, I would probably get one. But I haven't, it feels like somebody needs to invent a better mousetrap for us. I've seen some good models that people make where they're sort of semi-disposable, where they cut a piece of wood to be the channel in which they're cutting, and then over time you end up cutting through it. But there's nothing super great. This one needs another cut. So once again, this set that we're working on is going to become the locking points at the end of the tube, right? So we need it snug fit, and we need it to be big enough that the bead wants to hang out in the little donut that it creates. So I'm going to actually show that. So our bead chilling out, you guys can see it sits like a quarter of it sits into the jump ring, right? If we go with a much thinner jump ring, it doesn't really sit there, right? It just kind of hangs out and it's not going to get in far enough. Well, this would be a little smaller if I were doing that, but I have a smaller one. Let me see. It doesn't go far enough down. So these outermost ones really need to be thick enough to give that supporting little cup that we're doing. And it's going to be further hollowed either by the hollow form that I'm putting it on, or when you guys are doing your thing, you're going to have drilled out the little gap that is behind the jump ring on the end, right? So that we really get a good seat for the bead that we're snapping in. Okay, so we've got, that's not the current jump ring. These are the ones I want to solder. We got these 4 that I'm going to go over and solder with hard solder. The more that you can use hard solder during this exercise, the better. Which will be a little scary when we get to some of the add-ons, and it's not mandatory. I may go down to medium on my second inside locking mechanism because I'm a bit of a wuss. It'd be nice to be able to do everything with hard solder, but I am not that kind of a pro. Oops, I need that. I do need this. And for those of you that haven't been with me for any jump ring making or chain link making, there's a couple different ways to solder if you find that you over solder these. One is you can draw up, and the other is you can draw down. So most people think about being able to put a piece of solder in there. There's actually a third, which is with things this heavy, you could use chip solder and open them with your pliers just enough to clamp the piece of solder in between the seam. That's done by goldsmiths a lot because it has a lot less room to flow in gold than in silver, meaning silver will fill the gap a little better than gold will. So I'm just gonna, did I remember to do this? Flux these puppies. In this case, I'm going to do a couple one way and a couple another way. So I'm going to do, I like pick soldering for this kind of thing. Just getting it into the seam, making sure it's nice filled. Oop, into the seam, I said, not beside the seam. Come on. I'm going to try. Sometimes the littlest objects give you the biggest pain. Try it from this side. There we go. Okay. That little extra bit of solder can get in the way if you think you've got a really well-sized jump ring, but we're going to have to do cleanup to it no matter what we do. So this is from the from above method, and I always check both sides, especially on the heavy gauge work, because it doesn't always truly fill. So I need to add a little bit more to that puppy. Go. And then the other version, oops, except of course I used all of my wire pieces of solder. Hang on a sec. Cut a couple more. So the drawing up from underneath method, you take a little piece of either chip or wire solder. I tend to use wire because I like being able to see the directionality of the seam with it. And you put it down on your block. I like to do a piece that goes perpendicular and then fling my seam, rest my seam on top of it, right at that seam point so that you can actually see it settle. And one of the reasons I like to teach this method, especially to people that are having challenges with their soldering, is that gap, one, gets the heat flowing a little better, and two, you can see it settle so you know the solder has flowed. It's a technique I use in the hollow form work too, but it's especially useful as you're learning to do jump rings. For chains and things like that. And if you are wanting to practice your soldering, ain't nothing better than making a chain. That will get you lots of delicate solder practice.
Can you repeat that again? What were you saying? You put the chip solder and then you face it towards you before you solder the
So
ring?
I tend to use wire solder, but you can use chip solder in place of this. The reason I like wire solder is it runs, you can see the little line of the solder running parallel with the seam. I said perpendicular, I think. So my wire is running this way. My seam is right on top of it running this way. And because it's resting on the little bit of wire, it's lifted off the brick at the front. And so what I'll see
Oh,
is two indicators that let me know that it's flowed. One is the glow and flow that we usually get with anything, with flux and so on. And the other is it's going to settle. The jump ring will settle from resting here to being flat, right?
okay, so it's under. It's under.
It's
The
under,
solder
yeah,
is
it's
under.
under. So this is a draw up, as opposed
Okay,
to when I was pick soldering, I was flowing down, right?
okay,
Because gravity only needs to do so much for our flow. We can reverse gravity by flowing upward if we need to. Oops, I forgot to
okay.
flux again.
Thank you.
Yep. I do encourage learning to pick solder if you're doing a lot of jump rings, because you're going to need to get that precision to touch down tiny bits of solder when you're connecting your rings together. But you'll see this one, we should see a flow up. There we go. We saw it settle. It didn't really get fully flowed in there though, so I'm going to add some more from above. Oop, that's way more than I wanted. We'll do the other one and see if it settles better. That one's a little healthier. I also still like to have the pick available in case the jump ring wants to sort of shift on me. I can do a little encouragement back down. Or I can take a pair of tweezers, and this one in particular is not being round enough for me. It's kind of trying to push its way open. I'm just going to encourage. There we go. That's what I wanted. Tiny little squeeze to get it to go back to round.
What number are you using? What number tip do you normally use?
My go-to for about 95% of my work is a number 1 torch tip on the Smith acetylene. If I'm doing large scale work, I might go up. If I'm doing smelting, I go up for sure. If I'm doing tiny, delicate, like balling up of things and so on, I'll go down to a 0. But those are sort of my go-tos in general.
Okay.
All right, so we've got 4 soldered jump rings. I guess we don't have Sesame Street fans here. Count Von Count. And I need my already pulled out and put aside tiny little bezel mandrel, my round bezel mandrel, because I need to round these up to make sure that I'm truly getting a good snug fit. These were actually in pretty good shape to start with. And on this, I don't like to hammer on anything super solid. So I will take either my rubber mallet, my Delrin mallet rather, or rawhide mallet or wood one. And I'm going to work on my bench. And there's a nice little divot where I've been doing this for a while because that is a little softer. I'm not going to mar my my piece by doing it, but I am going to get it jumped down the ring. And so I'm doing 2 things. I'm pushing this way while it's in the little notch, and I'm hammering counter to that to try and force it round and down and flip it over and do the same thing again. And I want to pause and not do too much on until I've checked to see how close I am to my good fit. And I'm still a ways away from getting this onto my ring. So now I need to start stretching it instead of just rounding it. Here's where it gets a little mucky. This one I do go against a steel block, but I pad it a little bit so that I'm not marking things up. And I'm working down the piece. And I'm going to be hammering not the metal, but the stake. And I do a little bit and I tap, little bit and tap. And by doing this, I'm forcing a tiny amount of stretch down the piece, but it's not so tiny that we don't need to stop every few hits to check, because it goes from it fits barely to holy crap, I'm way too big for what I was doing. So this one is getting close, except that you remember I said that the tube doesn't want to quite be round once we've cut it. So I'm going to have to, I'm getting, I'll draw this shape because you won't be able to see it on camera. Right now, the mouth of this thing is kind of like this. So it flattens. It goes a little flat at the bottom. That's a bit of an exaggeration. It's kind of like that. But I want to round this, so I'm going to gently use the pliers to try and recircle it a little bit, re-round it. Because otherwise, when I get past that point, I'm going to suddenly have too loose of a fit. So what do I want for gentle pliers on this? Try it with these and see what we get. So I'm just doing a little tiny squeeze at the points that look like they're flattened to try and encourage it to think round thoughts. But these flat pliers may not, these plastic pliers may not have enough oomph to get me there. I may have to switch. I think I do. my flats that I had the tape on. There we go. And because this is an unsoldered seam tubing, I have to be careful not to over squeeze or I'll make it crimp in on itself. So it's really just a little bit of delicate encouragement.
Would you use a little file to open it up a little bit, the actual jump
So
ring?
just the interior of the jump ring, you could
Yeah,
absolutely. Just remember that these end ones, you don't want them to go flat. You need that donut shape by the time you're done. Of course, I've lost
okay.
track of which one was the one I sized. Let's see. Is that it? That's it. And I'm looking for this to be a fight to get on, which we've still got a little too much fight, so I'm going to do a few more taps. Yeah, if I had a little bit of solder blobbing in there that I think is the problem, I might go in with a file very, very lightly. But the more you file the inside of the donut, the flatter you're going to make it. Again, just a few taps at a time.
Okay.
And check it. See if we are going to fit on there. So close. I would say that this set is the hardest to get right, except for the other ones that are the hardest ones to get right. Like this one is, because it's first and because it's most critical. Oh, almost. It can be really frustrating. But the ones that hold the knocker to either side are equally precision based. They're just a tiny bit bigger because they need to slide past, and this one just needs to stop at the end. Oh, come on, I know you want to be part of this project. Come on, little jump ring. Not quite. Yeah, I hope you can see on screen just how much I'm having to force it. That's a good thing. You do not want this to go on easily on these end caps, or else they're going to slide around on you as you're trying to solder them into place when we get there. I'm just rotating a little bit between each tap to make an even push downward. And the problem with the hollow form version of this is that you can't really clamp it in anything like a ring clamp or something in order to hold it, so it's super awkward. Because if you do, you'll squish it, and then you won't ever get your round rings over it. Ah. Oh, so close, so close. Yeah, a couple more taps still. This would be the point at which you could, if you're really fighting it and it's not going anywhere, re-anneal. Because that could be part of it. But also, that's the point at which I go, oh, did I make it too big all of a sudden? If I push too hard once I've annealed it. So, all right, that is what I'm talking about. Okay, so we now have a ring. One ring that will fit on the end and stay there and not go past my starting point. But again, we check and see the bead is going to sit right in there nicely. All right. So there's one down.
That kind of looks cool
Thankfully, a
as a
few
ring
of,
itself.
oh yeah, yeah,
I
just
like
that
that.
kind of a thing. You could set a diamond into the end of the inside or something.
Yeah.
Okay, what's my next most likely candidate for one of these rings? Let's try this one. All right, so we're going to set that aside briefly while we work on the next one. Again, this step is really the rounding phase, just to make sure I'm starting. And you'll notice I'm hitting really like down the mandrel on this when I do this to get it to this center and round factor that I'm looking for. See where we're starting. Yeah, this one has a good long ways to go. Oh, that one went a lot faster. I don't know why, but it did. Okay, so we now have a pair of end cap rings. We are going to very carefully set them aside and remember where we put them, because those are some of the last ones we'll put, well, one of them is one of the last ones we'll put on. All right, next up, any questions on that before we go further? Okay, next up then, we're gonna make a slightly easier jump ring. We're gonna do a 14 gauge. Do I have any 14 gauge? And by the way, nothing says you can't cheat if you have pre-made rings, right? If you happen to have rings that fit your gauge, use them. Let's see whether these are, this might actually work. Hang on. Oh, yeah, this will be an easier ring to stretch. So I'm going to use 2 of these puppies. It's like micro taps away from being the right size. It's almost like past me was shopping to help current me. And the manufactured closures are way tighter than my regular ones. I'm going to make a spare just in case. Is that the same size? That is the same size. All right, we're going to pop back over. That's 3 fewer jump rings that you have to watch me struggle with. Okay. Boom, boom. Switch there. Going a little camera. There we go. All right. These I'm just going to tap enough to make sure that they're round because they were nearly perfectly sized. Make it too loose. So this set is the set that is going to hold the knocker in place. So it needs to be, and we have to solder it without soldering its buddy in the middle. So these have to be a really, really close fit so that we don't have too much trouble keeping the solder from flowing underneath it. They need a smidge bit of stretch, it looks like. The tiniest bit more. Times 6 o'clock. That's jump ring number 2. I need to go chasing after. There we go. Nope, that one. This is why we make spares. Whoop. Immediately went too big, right? So that one's no good. So my spare is oversized. Sure that I didn't start with it bigger. Okay, so I overstretched that one. And I overstretched the next one. Grrr. Okay, well, we're back to making a couple more. But I'll have some damn fine jump rings for other things down the road. Yeah, it really is like if I had done half the number of taps, that would have probably been perfect. It really is nuanced adjustments that you need to make to these things. Okay, back to the solder station. Again, feel free to pipe up if you have questions. I know it's just making jump rings, but it's making some pretty specific ones. Okay, 2, or is this 2.5?
Rachel, what kind of fire brick do you use right now when you were
It
soldering?
is a KN95, I want to say, but I will get that number for you. That one needs really serious grinding right now. I've been abusing it pretty much lately. It's the fire brick that John has always taught me to use, and they are
Okay.
available from a company in Pennsylvania and one store in California. And if you ever ask them, can they ship you a few fire bricks? The answer is a pallet.
Oh, okay.
So you and 100 of your favorite people need to get together and order a pallet,
Oh, bummer. So
right?
it's not just like a regular fire brick it looks
It's
soft to me.
it is a ceramic fire brick. And if you drop me an email, I'll post it to the Facebook group.
Okay.
Because I'd have to look up the exact one. There are multiple types of ceramics based similar things that can work, but this is the one that I find is the most useful. Okay, there we go. So, see how snugly I'm squeezing that one on? Like it's getting there past where our original ones were, but I'm going to have to force it down the line to get it past the hoop. And that's what I want, is I want to have to really work to get it into place. Oh, come on, little guy, don't get stuck there. So there's one. Yeah, it's a nice one because you can just grind it down on the sidewalk if it gets too grubby. It does get a little, at the further you grind, it gets a little too dusty for my tastes. But it's great because you can stick pins into it easily. And I like its refractive properties. It's my favorite soldering surface. Okay, this too will fit snugly. All right, so I'm not going to push that one all the way on, but we now have our two blocker ones. And next up is the one that the knocker is going to attach to. And I'm going to do I want to get fancy? No, not for this necklace. I think I want to just use the half round wire again. Yeah, I don't need fancy. So I could either do the 14 gauge wire, excuse me, the 12 gauge wire, and I could stretch one of these ones that we had done out enough that it can actually spin. I could make a new one that's designed specifically. Oh, maybe I have one that's big enough on my spiral. Nah, those are all small. Yeah, I think I'm going to just go with the half round again. And this one needs to be spinnable. So it should be loose to get on, not just able to be gotten on. So for this, I'm going to start with the same base that I did my other one, the original spiral, but I'm going to keep it loose on the band. So that's not the same size, is it? This is the size that I want. Eh. It's not working too well. Where are my pliers? And this one I can do a little bit more eyeballing of because it doesn't have to be the perfect snugness. In fact, it needs to not be the snugness. So I'm going to just saw this one at my estimation, and then I'll trim it back if I need to. Made it a smidge too small, which is okay. I'm gonna do my saw through trick to get a cleaner seam line, and then we'll stretch this puppy up. And once more, we're gonna try and round this up without marring it. So this one definitely needs a little bit of a stretch. It is still possible to overstretch this, even though it is the loose one. You don't want it super movable. You just want it enough to functionally pivot. Just like with the others, we're going to be cautious about how much we tap it up in size. Oh, and this one does have a big blob of solder inside, so I'm going to take care of that. Yeah, I still want that a little bit bigger than it is. Not much. There we go. Okay, so imagine that that one's all the way around. We're going to be soldering this outside one. This is going to hold the knocker. See how it can spin. And this one's going to trap the knocker to the other side. All right, so that's another set of them. Now we can actually bring back our first two. And we are going to make one jump ring out of, we're going to go with 14 gauge for this. These are the connectors to your actual necklace. Oops, not 10 gauge. My 14 gauge. So these jump rings will be responsible for either connecting the chain to the clasp or for opening and closing. And so for these, we can be a little more abstract in our sizing. I'm going to go one that is a little bit bigger, but not much bigger than one of the outside locking mechanisms, because that's going to be our trapped behind the lock component. And then we're going to do one that's a lot bigger. Let me cut that one first. material in my way. It's out of here. Actually snip this one because it's small enough to merit. I can clean it up. So this one is going to fit the ring well enough to be the locking mechanism, but it's not big enough to escape past the end ring, right? And then we're going to make one that can escape past one of those end rings. And so that's going to be considerably bigger. Not that considerably bigger. Let's see. Let's be that much yet. I'm just cleaning up the ends a little bit because I snipped instead of sawed. Okay. Back over to more soldering. Okay. Getting close to all the materials we need to get this going. What are we doing for time? 6:30. Okay, good. All right, so these last two, they need to be rounded up on my disappearing mandrel. Where is my mandrel? To put some tools away so I can actually see things. There it is. Sneaky. And in this case, I'm not trying to size, I'm just trying to get them nice and round. I already know that they are bigger than they need to be stuck on there. One. My other one. Good. Oh no. This is the problem with too many rings. Not those. Where'd I put my other ring down? This must be it. Okay, so we have the ring that will be locking it in place. That'll be behind the solder wall. And we have the ring that will be going over the other jump ring and being taken on and off. These need our last two jump rings. I'm gonna flatten these puppies out a little bit before I do this next step. And then I'm going to solder two last jump rings on, and these I absolutely grab pre-manufactured jump rings for, because they're just itty bitties that are going to be used as the hook off of the end of the connector, right? So I might as well use a nice clean solid jump ring. I still go with like a 20 gauge or something thicker even, depending on the proportions of it. Let's see what I got down in here. And it should be relative to your project that you're attaching it to, because this is going to be the piece that holds it to the chain, basically. These are not good proportional sizes. There we go. See some in there that I want to use. Maybe even slightly bigger. Nope, those are the right size. All right, and here is an important point. If you are making this clasp for future connection, I recommend leaving your slot, your open slot on the jump ring that you're connecting, out, facing outward. Don't try to solder it to the whole thing, because that then leaves you something you can connect to by opening your jump ring down the road. And with this, we want to do a little bit of an indent into the solder seam that we have in our big jump ring. So I'm finding where I put my solder seam, and I'm just putting a notch on the outside edge at that solder seam, which may take using a saw blade or a triangle file to start it, as it appears to in this particular case. So, notching. Using a round, I'm just putting a little U-shaped divot. Maybe, come on, don't bite me on this. There we go. Because what this will do is give it a little bit more surface area for the solder of the little jump ring, because I'm going to set the little jump ring into that notch that I've just made, and it'll give a little more solder surface area. Doing the same thing to the smaller of the two. Just enough of a notch to give me something to hold on to. Back over to the soldering. And once again, I'm going to grip these with the slice in my little jump rings facing outward, so that later on I will have a jump ring that I can just twist open, and then I'll do my final solder when I connect it to the necklace. So I tend to do that by putting the, clamping them in a pair of third hand with my opening at the top. And in this case, I'm going to try and use hard solder again because I'm just reflowing on top of my other solder seam. You can certainly use medium if you feel the need. It just gives you a little more luxury to maybe use medium when you're doing your final connection to your necklace. So you got to go in fast if you're going with the hard solder. And I'm setting it down into that notch in the solder. So now I've got my connector point that'll go to the chain and the thing that's holding it on to the larger piece, to the larger clasp section. Same thing on the one that we'll use for opening our clasp. Once again, keeping that slot up at the front, at the top rather. All right, we have made all of our freaking jump rings. So, any questions about that collective set of jump rings that we just dealt with? And are you guys understanding the relationship of the sizes to one another?
Yeah, but that
Yes.
was amazing. You put that tiny, tiny, tiny jump ring on that. You just soldered it. It's like, ah.
The reason that I'm able to do that is because I make chains over and over again, and boom, you go. And it's about using your proper tools for holding things where you want. So what we've got now is, although these are not positioned right yet, we've got our little guy that's going to get locked in that we just made, and our big guy that's going to be able to slide on and off. And I've got stockpiled over in the corner all of our other pieces. What are we missing? The knocker, right? So it's time to make that knocker, and that is done out of 12 gauge. And you're going to leave yourself extra 12 gauge on this. You don't need a ton extra, but make it a good 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches, depending if you want to add extra wiggle in the middle of it, even more. But now we get to do the fun stuff, which is using our flex shaft in ways that we don't usually. You can also do this next step by hand, but we're basically going to build a taper to stick into the hole of the bead, because as currently built, my hole is not big enough for the rod. But before we do that, we want to make absolutely certain that we've straightened out our rod. So I'm just going to do a little flat hammering. If you like the rolling between two blocks techniques, you can do that. But get it as straight as you possibly can, because you're going to see in a hurry if it's not really straight when we put it into our flex shafts. Okay, so the flex shaft trick. If you have a reversible flex shaft, you're going to want to do it one way. And if you have only forward, you're going to want to do it another. So I have a reversible. When I'm working with a reversible, I'm going to turn my setting to reverse, and I'm going to work with my on hand as the file that I'm about to do, and my offhand just holding things. If you're a lefty, you're golden just going forward, because you're going to be this way and you're going to be filing this way. What we're looking for is for the wire to be moving away from us. But if you're a righty who only has a forward moving one, you have to do this direction, and it's going to feel really awkward because your primary hand isn't doing the majority of the work, right? So again, you want this spinning away from you for this exercise. In my case, I have a reversible, so I'm going to go this way, and I'm set to reverse. hardest thing in the world. Don't forget to set it back at the end, because the next time you go to drill something, you're going to be like, why am I not successfully drilling a hole? It's because you forgot to take it off of reverse. So the first thing we're going to do is run a file straight across the end and just flatten up and clean up our work. And you're going to see if you get that little wobble. Let me see if I can show you guys the wobble. See, there's a little bit of wobble. If you're seeing that, grab like the wood handle of a hammer or something and just run it along the piece for a little bit and it'll straighten a little. You got to put a little force behind it. It'll get a little straighter. It doesn't have to be perfect. I may be making it worse today, but, and then we're going to just run the file back and forth at a moderate speed. You don't want to go super fast. And that's going to do a good, clean, flat surface on the top. And then once we're squared up like that, now we're going to create a taper off of that. So I'm just going to run at a bit of an angle, slowly, more slowly than I've been doing. We're just going to run the file forward and back and angle it a smidge. This is a flat file or a barrette file. Angle it and angle it until you start seeing a taper form at the end of your post. So it's not a big taper. It just has to be enough that when I find my errant bead, if I put my bead in, yep, still I need a little bit more. It's going to pop up there by about 1/4 of an inch or a couple millimeters. So get your taper part way up that shaft at the end. Whoop. Push too hard, that's what happens. Let's see if that's enough to get my bead in place. I still want to get a little further into the bead. I think I want to switch to a rougher file. This is also a method you can use for tapering your own pin shafts. If you want to make a pin back. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So I'm going to take this out and I'm going to go solder it. And you guys who have done hollow forms are going to ask, but don't we need a hole in there? The answer is maybe. You can get away with one solder exercise without it. And when we are doing our final attachment, we're going to be careful to not truly heat up the ball end of it. But we're also going to remember not to quench the knocker, because it is going to be an enclosed hollow form. So there is a minute chance of explosion, except it's super minute in this kind of situation. And it's going to be a tiny little pop if it does it. It won't do it on this first pass. It will only do it on a second subsequent soldering exercise.
Is there any reason not to use essentially a large granule instead of a hollow bead?
The only thing is it needs to be perfectly round for this particular exercise, right? So if you can get yourself, I don't even need to put this in that because it's pretty well stuck. You do not want an asymmetrical form.
Okay.
So
Right.
yeah, if you can get a good granule, because the object is being held by having fit a sphere into the curves that we've created between our
Right.
jump ring and either the hollow or what have you. All right, so once again, I'm going to use hard solder. And I want to get it in one shot, so I'm going to be pretty generous. And I got to be careful, that hollow form is the weak spot. So I'm more about heating up the shaft than the bead. And you'll see I'm doing a lot of this flicking so I don't overheat. And boom. Looks like I got it. Okay. I am not quenching that baby, because if I do, it's going to try and crunch in. I'm going to leave this off to the side for a moment. And we're going to start setting up our positions that we're going to need to solder in putting the unit together. So once again, we're going to get all of our little pieces here. Make sure I have the right rings because I managed to mix them up. Let's see, is that the set? Yes, that's the set. Okay, so order of operations. We're going to set aside our big, the open close one, because we don't need that until much later. And we're going to start with just one of our locking pieces. So before we do that, we need to figure out what is center. Actually, I do need that center one for a minute. So I want to find out what my direct line is from down in the middle. And that I'm going to mark. Really square it, but you can get the gist. If you have, I don't know where my circle template is, but if you have a circle template, you could get this more precise than I'm likely to be getting it. So if that's my center point, and then I put my, temporarily put on my ring that needs to be in the center, then I want the side one to be butted right up against it, so it's going to hold it in place. So that's a little off center for the side ring that we're going to put in place, and we're going to solder that one down. And if this slides around on you while you're soldering, you know you did not make it tight enough when you were sizing your this particular jump ring. And we really want to get a good, clean solder line on this if we can, right out of the gate. Remembering that I'm working with a hollow tube, so again, that's the collapsible weak spot. And I'm always working from the outside of this ring to get this solder. Except I'm going to drop my solder, so I'm going to start that again. What I mean by I'm doing it from the outside, I don't have to heat just from the outside, but I want to place the solder on the outer edge of where I'm trying to get it to flow. And then I'm going to try and get it to flow through and around as much as I can. There we go. A little bit of a gap to fill, which on the first ring is not a big deal, but if I have the same problem on my second ring, it gets a little trickier. Come on, little guy. There. Okay. Good flow all the way around. Big old blob of solder there that I don't want. There we go. All right, so position one is set. I'm going to let this cool. This won't be a problem to quench right now. Okay, that one we can quench. And now I go back over and I start putting the pieces that lock me into my path, because we've done the relatively speaking easy bit. So next up, I'm putting on my lock in place ring, right? And the first of my lock the ends rings. Okay, so my my connect to the chain ring doesn't get any soldering, but this one will. because I've got to solder it on to the end in order to tell myself, have I got my bead on the rod placed and sized where it needs to go. Okay. So, let's see, I don't like that positioning. Rotate that a little bit. Again, this has to be super, super snug. Make sure I've got the right side. Yes, I have the right side. Oop, maybe I don't have the right side. Let me try checking my center line again. I think I don't. Okay. So what
So,
I'm checking on that, guys. Sorry, go ahead. What I'm checking on this is I realized that I was working to the outside of the ring that I was doing instead of to the inside. So before I position it, I want to check, this is my center. So the side I'm about to lock in is the other side. So that's my ring that's going to be on there permanently. And then I'm going to close that end of it before I attach the next lock-in ring, because I need to position everything properly first. What
so
was your question?
the piece that you were just soldering, was that one
Yep.
of the end caps? Yes.
No, the piece I
No.
soldered is
Okay.
the one that locks in half of
Okay.
the toggle itself. Right
Okay.
now I'm about to solder on the end cap, the first end cap.
Right. The one that will lock the connector to the chain.
Yes, you
Okay.
got it. Third hand is absolutely a must for all of this sequence. And on this one, we want to be pretty consequential with our solder. Although I am going to go to medium now, switch around and use my medium, because we're at a place where I've got multiple hard solders that could get out of sync if I'm not careful. So I have some good pieces cut. And again, my goal is in quick and dirty if I can, or quick and clean, even better. But broadly, I want to go as fast as I can on this soldering so I'm not risking the other components. Don't be surprised by the pops and gurgles. It's the water coming out of the tube. And we want this solder to flow really, really well between the ring and the wall of the tubing. And I got parts of it, but I didn't get the top of it very well. So let me put a little more solder up top. No, not over. In, you silly thing. Oop, that is getting hot. Gotta be careful. Okay, we're gonna stop there. That was way more solder than I meant to use. So I'm gonna have some serious cleanup underneath. All right, but we've now got our locked in mechanism on one half. Gonna carefully quench. And now it is time to figure out our positioning of the toggle, of the knocker itself. And we're gonna go a little past my usual 7. Are you guys okay with that?
Yeah.
Everybody okay with going to the end of this one if we can?
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So we now know that our knocker is going to, it's going to be tight because I have to do some cleanup. It's going to be fitting in there, running down to that point. and I'm going to be putting it on this lock. So again, this is a point where you could decide to give yourself like an extra couple centimeters and do a squiggle in the middle, which I'm going to for the sake of this one, because I want squiggles in this particular design. And I'm just going to chop off a little bit of this because it is still too long, even with that. And I'm going to clean this up a little bit. And do I want to do some doming on this? I think I want to do a little bit of flattening and then. So if you want this to be super duper strong and you can manage, you can cup burr one end of this, the end that we're about to attach, and then you could put a divot in here. I'm not sure that with the half round choice that I made that I'm going to be able to really get a divot. So I think I'm going to do a little variation of what I did for the jump ring connectors and just make a filed divot that'll give me a little more surface area. It's not going to be ideal. It should be a dot, really. It should be a carved in position. But I don't think I'm going to be able to make that in this curve. Well, maybe once I've done this. Let me see if I can say again. Oh, I thought somebody had a question. Okay. So I'm just going to do a little flatten spot and see if I can get that divot, because it'll be a lot stronger if I can. Yeah, maybe I can get that. So that means popping on a cup burr on a ball burr, similar proportions. What do I have? Okay. See if I can get a nice ball burr end to my connector here. Oops, that's the ball burr, not the cup burr. Get a nice divot. Oop, what did I say about remembering to go forward? Don't forget to switch it back to forward. So I'm just putting enough of a divot. Again, the goal is give myself more surface area for the solder to connect. So what I'm looking for is a little bit of a divot, and then I'm going to cup burr the other end so that they have a good surface area to meet. Figure out where my big cup burrs are. Cup burr. Huh. I do not know where my cup burrs are right this instant, so this may be a little tricky. Bear with me a sec, gang. Go digging through some bins. Ah, there we go. No, yes, there we go. That's what I'm looking for. Okay, so for this end, I'm just, like you would on the end of an earring or something, putting a little bit of a round curve into it. Just enough that I'll have that surface area I'm looking for. And that's not a deep enough divot. Let's try that a little further. Okay, that makes me a little happier. I'm going to go attach these because I need them attached. And in this case, I'm going to try to do it with hard solder again because I'm about to be soldering with medium solder on the other side of it. So let's see, I want this there. And I'm going to put this in my clamp. And this is the only really minorly risky. If you overheat, you're going to have problems with that bead. And we want to, again, remember not to quench at the end of this. Solder. Come on. There's not enough solder on that. Give me a moment. A little bit more medium around the edge. There's a little bit of gapping going on right here that I'm trying to get filled, which means I'm way over soldering right now. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. Okay. Oh, nope. I'm not looking for that because it didn't get all the way to the other side. Always check the other side. This is not behaving. Not flowing back onto the ring. Come on. There we go. Okay, once again, we're not going to quench it. I say that out loud every time because I forget all the time. And while we wait for that to cool, any questions so far before we get to the home stretch? Or are we all with our ears bleeding out? I mean, our brains bleeding out our ears at this point.
Good.
Yeah. Okay. So all the steps individually are really reasonable, right? It's just the collective that becomes challenging and gets more challenging with each soldering step that we have to go through. But you will have success with this if you are especially careful of your jump ring sizing. That's one of the biggest things. And I'm going to do my next step without a blocker of, which I may come to regret, but I don't use a whiteout or anything, but you can absolutely put a whiteout down if you want. I say that now, and as soon as I've done that, I've jinxed myself, I'm sure. But in order to keep it from flowing, I just find that I can never be neat enough to keep it from stopping. It always ends up stopping the things I don't want it to stop. So I'm going to try without using a blocker. But what you can do is use a charring. So if you've never used if you're using an acetylene torch, you can create a char on your piece on the ring so that it will not actually be as likely to stick. I'm saying that really badly. Basically, by using the nasty part of acetylene, in fact, I'll do that while we're waiting for this to cool, just so we know we have it well charred. If you cover up the holes, you get that nastiness out of the out of the torch. So by blocking the oxygen, I'm making the acetylene burn, and it creates a charcoal, basically, on your piece. And that acts as a temporary deterrent, similar to what you get when you put down a whiteout or something like that. So you guys can see that I've actually got a little blackening on there. That's going to be good for me in the long run. But I, of course, have to cool it again for a moment. Because that'll act as the flow deterrent, where I want it to not be flowed while not blocking me from soldering the piece that I want, that I'm going to have to lock it in place. I hope that made any sense at all. Didn't feel like it coming out of my mouth. So my next
Rachel?
step, yep.
There's still that noise in the background.
Did it come back? Because
It's not as bad, but every time you talk, it's still.
Here, let me put the little fuzzy thing back on the mic and see if that helps. Except it doesn't want to stay. Is that any better? Yes,
I
no?
don't know until you talk.
I'm talking, I'm telling you the awesome things that we are going to do with these jump rings. Is it still hissing?
Yeah.
Shoot.
It's vague, but it's
I think we may have to live with it for the last bit of this, and then I'll work on improving it further
okay.
through the Zoom settings. Let's see, are we cooled off? Okay, so we now have our slightly intentionally charred bar. We have so much solder on there that I now need to clean some of it off after having charred it. Is that true, or am I just not pushing it through enough? No, I want to get rid of some of that solder, or else it's going to flow where I don't want it to. Yikes, put way too much solder on this. Okay, how are we doing now? There we go. All right, so I've got my bar. Doing okay on that rotation. Yeah, we need to take a little bit more off of that. See, that's how close our measurements are, our tightness and our fit on these is that a little bit of solder can really jam up the works. And in this case, by leaving that much solder inside, I put a much greater risk of soldering the centerpiece to it as I put its locking mechanism in place. Okay, so I've got free movement, and I'm going to be zigzagging inside of this to bring this down. I may have left myself a little too much, so I might regret that. That's going to be a lot of squiggle. I'm going to put some of that squiggle in here and see what I've got. Let's use Still way off. I may need to chop this back down. Yep, I left myself way too much material, gang. So I'm gonna pull this apart and trim it back. Apologies for last minute adjustments that are needed. Let's see how fast I can make a replacement jump ring for this. And I'm just gonna go with flattening and not do that whole shenanigans of the cup burr. Start time. Let's see, do I have another jump ring made for the center from my other one? I think I do. Beautiful. This is why we have spares. Okay, I'm gonna put that on this one. Go with me. Yeah, I encourage you to not do the half round version for your first attempt. And instead, when you get to this stage, you put a little curve with a half round, with a round file or a crossing file or something so that it follows the curve instead of doing the divot method that I just did. That was a rushed approach, in my opinion. And I'm going to make sure that I'm not still too tall for this. That'll give me enough room that I can tweak it. And once more into the breech. I'm going to try and get that soldered down so that we can do the final steps. Put my goggles. Oh, I wanted to use hard solder. Nope, that one actually did pretty well, but I don't want to quench, which I always have to remind myself of. I'm gonna do a little dribble instead. Okay. Take 4 or whatever we're up to. All right, I now have a less junked up ring. And I'm almost in position. Now when I do the squiggle to it, I'll be able to make it actually fit down in until it tucks in. Do a little bit of this off the ring so I'm not mangling the ring. Oop, a little bit more. Oh, close.
The camera is still aimed at the soldering bench.
Oh, sorry about that. I'm
That's
sitting here
okay.
working away on. Thank you.
I figured it's getting late, so we get it.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. And if you guys want me to stop and do this in the next session, I can. But we are really down to the last of the solder steps after I get this positioned. So it's 2 more jump ring solders and we're done. They're just tricky jump ring solders. All right, I'm going to do my final tweaks. Maybe that's going to do it on the sizing, but basically I've just put my squiggle in to bring it down so that it'll hit the connector. There's going to be a little adjustment I have to do on that. And then I'm putting my other locking ring, which my other locking ring is. Locking. This is again one of those ones that we want super duper snug. Come on. Yeah, there we go. Goodness, this one's a little extra snug. see if maybe I pulled the wrong of the two. Nope, that's definitely the right one. Ah, I just had it at a funny angle. Okay, so there we go. Right, so the scariest of all of our solders is this one that's going to lock the knocker in place in its final spot. Come on. Because what we want, there we go, is we want the solder to hit only on this outside edge so that I can still move this after I'm done. Right, so we got it snugged up, almost snugged up. Snugged up there. We're going to do super quick, super fast soldering there. And then our last one will be putting on the closing cap. Hopefully, this all goes according to plan. All right, and I'm going to use medium solder. And in this case, I'm going to choose either tiny, tiny little bits of wire, or I'm going to use my little chips to try and get them flowing quickly without hitting the other piece, because this has to go in as fast as I can make it. Come on, little chips. Put a few little chips around, but not a ton. As my goal is to heat not this, but this. And I am flicking because I want to be able to pull out of the heating as soon as I see that flow tuck under this side of the jump ring. Yeah, scary. Scary. Come on, keep being mobile. Don't you flow at all. We're still moving there. Come on. Almost. Come on. Flow. Flow. But no more flow with that. There we go. Okay, I'm stopping there because that's attached. It ain't beautiful. I'm going to have a lot of solder cleanup from the little blobs. But I now have my locked-in knocker that, whoops, still moves. And one thing I'll warn you of is not to freak out. Oh, it still moved when I stopped. Come on. Not to freak out like I am right now. Because it's often just flux that's holding it in place. Oh, come on, please tell me this is just flux. It was moving. Arr. Sometimes, oh, yep, it's got movement. Yeah, this one's flux. So it's still got movement. I'm going to have to pickle it before I'm going to get that action to fully become a knocker again. But the fact that I can still move it is what I'm looking for. And once I pickle, it should take care of that last jam up. That plus some action moving it back and forth for a while. So now I've got my last one, which again still is a risk, but not the same risk as that last attachment that we just did. So here's our final ring. Okay. back to the bench. Oh, sorry, I forgot to switch over. All I did was put my last ring in place. And I'm going to get the other stuff out of the way. And I will not blame you at all if you want to go to an easy solder for this final one. If you've made it through all of the trauma of these earlier pieces, then, and you feel the need to go easy solder on this final solder, I will completely understand that. In my case, I'm going to try for medium. Just because I hate the color of easy solder. And my heat is focused really on getting the ring soldered on around the last piece of this. Half did it. A little more solder. All right. It ain't pretty until we pickle it and get it working again for the slide bys, but that is our finished knocker clasp. It'll need some cleanup, it'll need some polish, it'll need a whole heck of a lot of tiny little bits of sanding on my edges of the solder blobs. I'm gonna let that cool so we don't have to quench it. And I highly recommend you give yourself way more than 2 hours or whatever it was, 3 hours to do one of these. Got any questions, gang?
It's inspiring. It's you did a great job tonight. It came together, and it is a cool piece. There are a lot of ideas of modifying it as a catch and also as maybe something fun to play with. A piece of jewelry that you can manipulate, move around, and play with.
Yeah, so if you were going to put it on a mid-weight, just plain old chain and put it in the center, you could absolutely do that. It could be a front hang clasp. I would probably do something decorative, like set a gem in the front of the bead or something like that, or do some detail in gold or something like that. But yeah, it could certainly act as its own clasp. It will hang a little different. If you were to just literally hang it off of a chain, hang on a sec, let me show you the one that I've got. If you were to just hang it off of the front of a chain, it would pretty much do that or that, right? So it would hang, if I were putting it as a centerpiece, when it's in the back, it's getting an equal stretch across the neck, so it goes like that. But you're right, it could absolutely be its own little art piece in the front of something. Especially once you start playing with variations on the shape. And for that, I would say there's a whole lot you can do with shape in terms of connectors. But the variations on the theme, once you start thinking about this as a piece, if you stop worrying about just the knocker and start using it in elements, the idea of a pass-through friction combo, right? You can build these, you could build a knocker onto the top of a hollow form with a latch at the top. There's a whole bunch of, conceptually, putting it on its side like that gives you a lot of variation. So yeah, absolutely. I can't wait to see what you guys dream up with this kind of a clasp. either exactly as he designed it or some cool new variant. I never saw him do anything but this basic round one. I mean, I think he may have had a couple examples where he had the decorative wire on some of the pieces, but so I will, because that's going to take a while to cool and pickle, and I don't want to keep you guys even longer. I will have photos of it for you all once it's cleaned up, and we'll show it again at next session, which will be, what's the date of our next session? January of 2025 already. Yikes.
15.
The 15th. Yes, thank you. Holy cow. Is that really the third? I guess it is because we got a New Year's on a Wednesday. So yes, I will see you all on the 15th. And we will probably go back to the big hollow form and the hinges that failed to be a part of the session that didn't get well recorded and didn't have good sound. I'll do a little more playing to make sure that this mic is working as best it possibly can. And hopefully by then I will also have my class dates roughed in at least.